where as long as Kosovo dispute remains unresolved, that means that Belgrade remains politically dependent on Russia for its UN Security Council veto. Number two, energy dependence, which Sir Stuart Pitch already mentioned. And point number three, which is frequently overlooked, it is soft power, but not soft power in terms of whether your cultural or political model is appealing, but sheer raw public opinion popularity of Russia among major parts of the local population. And so what are we seeing at this moment in time? We are seeing, of course, that energy is the problem, and Serbia has been able to secure some deals based on bilateral ties that it has with Moscow, and so did Viktor Orban. But there will be other, of course, problems when the winter comes in terms of electricity supplies and in terms of oil supplies, but that's a different matter. But still, nevertheless, despite everything, Serbia is still not shy away from any energy diversification program, as we have seen, for example, in regards to interconnector in Greece, for that matter. But the Kosovo dispute remains also in play, and the second potential protector for Serbia, China, is not willing to step up because it, for now at least, China still upholds to its old principle of not sticking out in international conflicts and dispute where its own national security interests are not at stake. But the biggest problem in this case is the large popularity of Russia in Serbian public opinion. Now, I was one of those who expected that the pressure will be so severe on Belgrade government that they would have no choice but to crumble, but to join EU sanctions. But it appears that there is a big problem, and that problem is called actually the public opinion. I haven't seen the latest stats, but I can tell you that the numbers are probably astounding. But it has been, on one hand, this popularity has been the product of, number one, it is not the product of any pan-Slavic, pan-Orthodox philosophical Russophilia. It has been, number one, the product of frustration with memories of the Western policies of the 1990s and frustration with the independence of Kosovo 2008. But number one, it has been also the product of very radical pro-Russian narratives, which have been circulated daily in pro-government media and pro-government tabloids since 2014. So you may frequently talk about Russian or Chinese disinformation in the Western Balkans, but frequently the source of this pro-Russian and pro-Chinese media is not the product of Russian troll factories or some organized campaign. Most of the time, it's much closer to home. And why did the ruling elites in Serbia do it? Number one, simply to court pro-Russian voters. But number two, it was part to blackmail the West. Because the idea was, if the West believes that the regime is surrounded by, is constantly besieged by pro-Russian agents, that means that the West will turn a blind eye to any democratic transgressions and any rule of law transgressions. But now, we have seen that the ruling elites in Serbia have, in a sense, fallen into their own trap. So he cannot reverse the boat which he has been sailing on for the past 8 years with such ease. With that in mind, of course, there is a natural risk that you're all asking. I mean, is there a potential of an overspill of any form? Now, probably some of you have frequently heard one word of the way Russia perceives the Balkans, the so-called Europe's soft underbelly, the region of potential vulnerability where Russia can instigate controlled crisis, all with the purpose of getting even with the West and diverting Western attention away from the post-Soviet space, primarily Ukraine. Now, of course, so far it has been the policy of control crisis, but now, of course, even the big concern is whether this time Russia will, of course, throw down the gauntlet and throw away even the niceties and subtleties. I will tell you, I think I am less concerned about this for the simple reason is that in order to do so, Russia needs local players. It needs assistance from the local players, and despite all the talks about pro-Russian versus pro-Western sentiments, the local power holders in the Western Balkan only have one value and one religion, and that is the one they see when they look in the mirror. It is how they are going to survive in power. So yes, they may want to play Russia in order to get a better bargain with the West in order to secure their hold on power, but they don't want to be used as anyone's cannon fodder. So, on that point, I will essentially conclude, and while you may not be particularly reassured with this conclusion, but it's a quote from HBO series Chernobyl, not good, but not terrible either. So, I mean, of course, the meltdown did happen after that, but I'm betting still pretty much on the self-preservation instincts of the local elites for that not to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that was quite some food for thought. As announced before, I will turn now to Sir Stuart for a question or two. You mentioned that UK is supporting any regional initiative that is inclusive in order to make some progress in settling the problem, the regional affairs. At the same time, these regional initiatives sometimes come in a sort of a competition with other attempts that are aiming at solving these problems. Do you see that as a competition, and if not, how can they be synchronized or coordinated or something, so that they don't clash at one time or another?
The answer to many of the dilemmas posed is regional cooperation, and there are already over 60 different formats in the Balkans. So the obvious answer to the question, which is an important question and it's a very topical question, is surely the war in Ukraine and the situation Europe is now in, from the local family village level all the way up to states and capitals, now is the time to cooperate. I mean, to pose challenges, which is what conferences are supposed to do, if we all maneuver or move, better word, around the region, we can see ourselves as people that the infrastructure is not regionally connected. The road, rail, port, airport infrastructure is not the most efficient and interconnected in the world. And that's what's needed and necessary. And that those projects need to be international projects, not just islands of small steps. So actually, infrastructure may seem like a boring topic. I don't think it is in this university and institution. But I think this year we've seen for ourselves, and all of the people have seen, what happens when supply is stopped and restricted. And so I think there is a wake-up call now to precisely not to allow a competitive framework of overlapping patterns of regional cooperation, all of which end up with micromanaging small packets of progress, but actually a bigger idea. The bigger idea surely is to cooperate with each other, whether it's rail, which I think is lacking in the whole region, or modern ports, which can both use the rivers as well as the seas of the region, and then, of course, airports where appropriate and necessary, and then the connecting tissue between with highways. I've driven extensively in this wonderful peninsula, and I think there is need to really focus on infrastructure. And then in economic cooperation, the more we can do to reduce friction, reduce tariffs, reduce barriers, reduce waiting times at borders, these seem like non-important issues, but my word, they create friction, they slow down all the economic opportunities the region should be experiencing and indeed encouraging at this time of war on our continent. And I know my friend is in the audience, Ben Hodges, and actually what I've just said is also a strategic point, because we need to be able to have a strategic movement in and between and within our continent, and not these endless difficulties that we face. So this is a moment, surely, I know it's a plea, if there's ever been a moment for regional cooperation, it's now.
Thank you. Well, like they say, any crisis brings around an opportunity, so perhaps this might be used as an opportunity. But for the time being, we are talking about a crisis whereby the Russian influence, although our colleague from Serbia, Mr. VUKSANOVIĆ, has said it's the same, has not increased. It was there already. But so, Stuart, since you are so knowledgeable of the area, how do you think this influence might be countered or mitigating at least, if not rejected?
Well, the truth is a word to answer the influence. I think there is, as was discussed in the very first session, there's an information campaign which is being waged against us. And when I say us, I mean everybody in the West, whether they're in the NATO alliance or the European Union or both. There are all sorts of lurid and other forms of information available on social media which make all sorts of claims on a daily basis. And so sifting through that, I'm sure with my colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina here, I'm sure he can explain just how hard it is to understand completely the media landscape on this peninsula called the Balkans, and it's bewilderingly complicated, and just how difficult it is, that elusive problem of media regulation. It's not a topic perhaps for today, but it's a very tricky topic. So there is a lot of noise. There are also, let's be clear, Russian influence in politics. And respecting Mr. VUKSANOVIČ's views, there is Russian influence in politics across the region, both within ethnic communities at local level and above that level. And I'm sure my colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina won't mind me saying, I think actually in Bosnia and Herzegovina, just before the election, we're likely to face a month of interesting media from Bosnia and Herzegovina. But it isn't just about the media. It is about the darker side of Russian influence, which is not new. The Russian way in war itself is not new. And many of the horrors, the tragedies we see in the Ukraine war, they are very reminiscent for many of us who've served in the military of former wars. And that doesn't make them right at all. And of course, Russia does specialize in not just propaganda, but coercion. And people often coerce themselves as well as being coerced. But I think it's true that we have to be very careful about the past. We have to be very careful about how we talk about history. And what I often say in these sessions, noting this is a controversial thing to say, is we have to look forwards, not backwards. This is not the 1990s. Not a day goes by in the region without another memory being revived of the 1990s. But it's not the 1990s, it's the 2020s. And we owe it to the next generation to look forwards and not backwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so Stuart, we greatly thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to go.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it so happens that so Stuart has mentioned Mr. LATAL several times. So by coincidence, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. At the last conference organized by New Strategy Center in Timisoara in June, at the panel where I was speaking, I said that the war in Ukraine has added a new layer of complexity to already difficult situation in the Balkans. The concern was, as mentioned by my co-panelist, Ambassador Peach and VUKSANOVIĆ, was the very strong Russian influence that was already present in the region. One of the chief allies of Russia in the region is, as some of you may know, Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik. It was not coincidence that he already met Russian President Putin a couple of months ago in St. Petersburg, and as far as I understand, he's going to see him probably again in the course of September as a part of his pre-election campaign, because Bosnia and Herzegovina is holding elections just like Bulgaria on October 2nd. So 2 months after Timisoara, I have to share with you some good news and some bad news. The good news are that there are no indications whatsoever that Russia has tried or achieved anything in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in the rest of the Balkans relevant to the current situation or the current series of crises in the region. The bad news is that Russia didn't have to do anything in Bosnia or in the rest of the Balkans, because local actors and Western actors are doing quite a lot. I will very briefly touch upon local, regional, and some of the global aspects, and try to leave more time for questions. Now, to start with Bosnia and Herzegovina, which seems to be falling headlong into a yet even deeper crisis. The crisis is that the country could already, by the time of the elections in October, could see the effective end of the Dayton Peace Accord. The problem at hand is that in these elections we may see, unless the current electoral regulations are changed, Bosnian Croat parties may lose their political influence in the federation entity, which would essentially represent a major breakdown of one of the key principles of the Dayton Peace Accord. And would, if that would happen, would lead to likely walkout of both Bosnian Croat and Bosnian Serb officials from joint state and entity institutions. The question is whether the international community will address this problem and maybe try to arrest this problem, at least for the time being. As some of you may know, Bosnia's High Representative Christian Schmidt has already imposed one part of changes to the electoral system, but mainly addressing the technical issues. And there is an ongoing heated debate and controversy whether he will impose the second part of the package that has already been discussed and prepared by American OHR and some European experts. But the problem is that he's facing very strong resistance from Bosniak officials, Bosniak media and intellectuals, as well as from some EU member countries. So stay tuned. The outcome of this issue, the outcome of the elections may change the situation in the country even dramatically very soon. Looking at the rest of the region, although unfortunately usually Bosnia and Herzegovina is the one perceived as being constantly in crisis, and many people are getting sick and tired with this constant crisis, citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina more than the others. I can see problems and dark clouds growing all over the horizon. One thing that my colleague Vuk did not mention is, or at least not elaborate upon, is a relationship between Serbia and Kosovo, which seems to be growing more and more tense. What I'm hearing from, after just, since I came from Belgrade and had some meetings there, and what I'm hearing from my friends and colleagues is that both ordinary people and experts in Kosovo, both in Kosovo and in north of Kosovo, are becoming increasingly concerned of possible violence. We are seeing in Montenegro that government has lost support and Montenegro may be heading into yet another elections. North Macedonia has been completely crippled by the European Union inaction towards it, which is having serious repercussions for the political situation in the country and may lead to the return of nationalist parties to power very soon. Altogether, what we are seeing across the Balkans are serious attempts from all sides, be it from Sarajevo, Mostar, Banja Luka, Zagreb, Belgrade, or Pristina, or Tirana, to completely rewrite the recent history of the region, where one side is not to be blamed, but everyone else is. So to come to a brief conclusion regarding the local and regional issues, unfortunately, there is nothing good that we can expect from the region by itself. Local actors in the Balkans, politicians, but unfortunately also media, civil society, and intellectuals, or what's left of them, they are not able, maybe not even willing, to improve the situation in the Balkans and to create a more stable and prosperous environment in the region. In this kind of situation, the Balkans once again depends on the international community, but then what we are seeing from the international community is getting from bad to worse. We have heard some very strong and very good statements, some very good words from the speakers at the opening of this conference. We have heard that the European Union is more united than ever. We have heard that the European Union needs to deliver and finally build its presence in the Balkans through the enlargement process. But in reality, what we are seeing is more and more divisions within the European Union on local, regional, and geopolitical issues. I'm currently undertaking research for a policy paper that I'm doing on foreign influences. And what I'm hearing from Western Russian experts is that Western reaction to the war in Ukraine and everything that US and the EU and UK have done to address the war in Ukraine actually almost created the opposite effect in Russia. It has only strengthened Putin. It's not weakening him. So I think that the entire concept of Western attitude towards the war in Ukraine should be seriously reassessed. We have heard from several speakers in the last panel and from Sir Peach today that the Balkans is on the verge of serious problem, and that the Balkans should not be allowed to switch from being a political problem to become a security problem. But as I told you, we may already be there in a month or two. You know, to conclude, the time is running out. The time is seriously running out. I think that the entire Europe, including the Balkans, as the winter is approaching and as there are no indications that the war in Ukraine will end by this winter, will face some very, very serious choices and some very, very difficult situations. So I would like to reflect what was said in the previous panels, unity of the European Union and much stronger and wiser, concrete, realistic attitudes are required as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. LATAL, winter is coming. Well, winter is here already. Let's move to more sunny shores, somehow, Professor Murat Aslan, I was thinking about the sunny shores of the Mediterranean. But please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me in here. This is my third time in Romania and delivering a speech on similar things, because we always discuss the same sorts of escalations, threats, and concerns just because of the realities on the ground. On the other hand, I would like to remind one thing. Security is something which is indispensable and requires a continuity in terms of promoting it. You can't say there's a bus stop and just get out of the bus and just breathe for a while. Security is something, it needs continuity. You need to have measures, implementing all sorts of measures in the meantime. And if you go to the Western Balkans, or the Balkans at all, doesn't matter, because it's only Turkey out of this picture. When you say Western Balkans, it's only Turkey left aside. Well, you have to have some parameters. Geography is one thing, for instance. Actors involved is another thing. And if you say actors affiliated with the security concerns of the region, well, it may be individuals anymore or societies at all, but it's something important that either alienating a certain portion of people or promoting. It's something that you can create a further crisis as a seed to be planted for future. So Western Balkans, or Balkans at all, have a potential either to escalate or stabilize, depending to the statements, narratives suffered. If you link this general picture to Balkans, well, one famous book circulated, and today it has been circulated, it's the Huntington, and it was also yesterday, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Actually, I focus on the second portion of this title, it's Remaking of the World Order. Well, it's a bit US-centric, but the sort or categorization of civilizations in the book is a bit with prejudices. That's clear. On the other hand, I do not believe that civilizations are not only a point of mobilizing an act, but interests or some other collateral feelings that will encourage exactly or exaggerate exactly the narratives with actions. In this sense, Balkans has become not only a crack point or crack line of civilizations, but a point of struggle, a potential struggle with interests of the third parties. And it had been as such. For the latest aggression on Ukraine by Russia is a clear signature. How? This latest incident, this latest aggression reminded us one thing. Now we are in an age with a mixture of traditional warfare, traditional engagements with not traditional, with asymmetric and symmetric, regular and irregular. These are the words that we claimed after the Cold War, and reminding the old versions of them that reminds us the Cold War. Regular and irregular was, they were just the terms of the Cold War era that reminds us how to fight against the Soviet bloc. Regular with traditional forces and irregular with special forces or others. Or we have new terms like proxies, hybrid, or etc., but they are still valid. So you see, we had a total war conceptualization after the First World War, and today we have a new sword, which I call as complex war. We will face all sorts of assets, methodologies, and also means to counter the other in the new age. So once there happens a conflict, either in Europe or outside, doesn't matter, then we should expect a mixture of them enriched by the third parties through, for instance, proxies, radical elements, or etc. So Balkans and crisis, these are the words that I refrain to use. Unfortunately, we have to learn how to manage. My approach in here leans on first demography. Now we are in an age that demography is mixed. We have many Serbs and Bosnians living together in Sweden, for instance, side by side. They are neighbors. We have lots of thousands of Syrians in the capitals of Europe. We have new ghettos of differing societies. That means once there happens a crisis in Balkans or etc., doesn't matter, the streets of the European capitals will somehow be chanted by these individuals or societies. So it's a risk for societal cohesion in the Western countries. Another term I would put forward is the soft threats and soft concerns. I continuously repeat this term in many occasions, even in my lectures in the university. Well, mostly the Western or the European thinking leans on immigration. But it's just one. What about radicalism? Radicalism of not only one sort that comes from, Islamic tradition, etc., but think about extremism. Latest incidents in Syria indicated that extreme left and right, they are able to unite themselves for the cause of fighting against an enemy. It was Daesh. And now they are lone wolves attacking people innocent across the streets. So consequence of a conflict in any region, but mainly in Balkans, is such sort. If you just remember the 1990s, please, we had Iranians and Saudis or Saudi-backed groups in Bosnia. Well, a repetition of that means the same thing, I believe. Another issue that I should put forward is the competition of the European powers. Well, we have EU. They have a foreign policy, even though it's not binding for the countries to implement the same policy in case there happens a conflict, but still there's a competition. The significant case for this is Libya. France and Italy competed in Libya, one favoring East and the other one was favoring the West. So, if it happens again in Balkans, then we will see diverging interests of the European powers. That's another issue I should remind. Another factor I should recall is history. Because most conflicts in Balkans are somehow exaggerated or circulated by the narratives of history. And Turks are the most common circulated word in this. On the other hand, these words are just justifications for further escalations and conflicts that feeds itself. So we should think about exactly the curricula of the schools in Balkans. Another issue I should remind is the technology and the modern conflicts, modern features of conflicts. Today, the new fighting cells, either individuals, small groups, or societies at all, doesn't matter, or states, well, they are able to reach technology from the net. You can buy a drone from a Chinese, website and easily use it. Then vulnerabilities are really high. So after Russian aggression, then we should revisit the older conceptualizations like statistical or revisionism. We should exactly visit populism, mainly exaggerating or just scratching nationalism. We should also think about the collateral effects like economy, finance. Now, there are Russian businessmen trying to get out of Russia and build business either in Turkey, United Arab Emirates, or Central Asian countries. Then there will be a reaction to Putin maybe from these businessmen in future because they will lose. Corruption and organized crime. Now, in Balkans, if you ask me what's the top priority as a threat, it's organized crime. They are ready to fight forces, especially in the western side of the Balkan Peninsula. Once a crisis erupts over there, these are the proxies be exploited by the third parties. And one recommendation in here, well, in order to avoid of a probable or potential conflict, I think we must be, as think tanker, we must be able to list the potential crises and the problems in Balkans. I started listing it just period to this event. It was huge, actually. For instance, language. What's the condition of being an EU member for Macedonia that's imposed by Bulgarians? It's language. What was the condition of being a NATO member for Macedonia? It was the name of the country. You see, we have vulnerabilities not only because of the ethnicities or etc., but language, the name, or etc. I mean, there are many things to be dealt. Transdniester, we have Russian military presence over there. And think that once you step up the wrong stone, it's a reason to start another wave of, conflict at either at a lower profile or higher profile, doesn't matter. Kosovo has just been a point of concern. It was 2 weeks ago, and now, well, it has been stabilized, but who can guarantee what will happen maybe 2 weeks later? So, as a concluding remark, I would like to touch the Turkish position as a Turkish academic, only for 1 minute. Turkey preferred strategic autonomy for the last decade, and it's not because the external developments or the, preference of the Turkish leadership, but it's because the united synergy of internal developments and external ones. In this case, Turkey started to interact with all sorts of actors and pursued an open gate diplomacy. That means Turkey was competing with Russia and also cooperated with Russia. Turkey is the only country who just pulled the trigger against a Russian soldier in Syria right after the Second World War. And think that Turkey is the only country who fought against Iranian forces in Syria. But we have an Astana process ongoing. That means Turkey's foreign policy structure is blended with both cooperation and competition. And if you go to the Western Balkans, Turkey does not want to experience another 90s because of the collateral effects to the wider region. Because Turkey is well aware of one thing, Balkans is not away from the Caucasus, the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean Sea, or etc. And one definite thing to be concerned in here is the Turkish-Greek problems. Once there happens an escalation between Turkey and Greece, I don't expect a war, by the way, but it will have consequences in Balkans too. So this is another thing should be concerned. So I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Aslan Efendi, for this interesting and exciting, exciting remarks. And last but definitely not least, Ambassador JACKOVICH. You'd remember he was our guest last year as well, and I will not hesitate to say again what I said last year. What he doesn't know about the Balkans is not worth knowing. So, Ambassador, shoot.
Shoot. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be in Bucharest with so many experts and specialists, and to be invited by the new Strategy Center. I will skip over comments about the terrible thing that is happening in Ukraine, because we all know this. We've heard it from previous presentations, and it's well known to us. Also, President Putin's miscalculations about the unity of the West and the resistance of the Ukrainians, I think all of that is clear to us. I would like to say that this certainly points out to the West the dangers of cross-border nationalism, and how that, if it is transplanted to a place like the Balkans, and former Yugoslavia specifically, can be very problematical indeed. Geographically, if I look at the region, I say there are four points, and forgive me, I sometimes do university lecturing, so I like to tell people there are 4 points, there are 5 points. 4 regions that I identify. Number 1 is Bosnia, because the possibilities of the changes in the electoral law could actually strengthen ethnic divisions. The leadership of Republika Srpska, the Serb part of Bosnia, is threatening separatism, but you also have on the Croatian side what looks like attempts to declare their own territory, possibly, or something like that, on the territory of Bosnia. Montenegro, number 2 in my listing, where ethnic tensions are more acute following the fall of a second government. And very interestingly, one of those governments signed an agreement with the Serbian Orthodox Church, which was very controversial and remains controversial in that country. Kosovo, the relations between Serbia and Kosovo are not progressing. You have Kosovo constantly taking measures to emphasize their sovereignty as a state. And you have Serbia that is constantly being pressured by the West to recognize Kosovo as an independent state, Serbia being the most pivotal of all the states in former Yugoslavia. And fourthly, I would put Moldova, because Moldova is undergoing constant crisis. You have a pro-Western government at the moment in Moldova, constantly under pressure from pro-Russian elements. All of this is linked with Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, and all of it is exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. Is Russia active in the Balkans? It is very active, and it is being more active as a consequence of what's happening in Ukraine, even more than it was before. Politically, it is active in supporting political parties, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies. I mentioned earlier Republika Srpska. Milorad Dodik has been mentioned by other panelists. I think he has visited Moscow more often than any other Western destination, probably more often than all the Western destinations put together. Some support for Russia in the Balkans emanates not from a genuine political conviction, but as we heard earlier, and I agree with that comment, frustration with the West, frustration with what is perceived as weak support on the part of Western governments for what is happening in the Balkans. Economically and commercially, yes, there is an attempt in many cases for Russian penetration of enterprises in various states of the Balkans, but that is not so successful because they're not so powerful there. It is the energy supplies in the Balkans that is the key thing when it comes to economic power by Russia. I find the activity of the Orthodox Church in the Balkans to be of great interest, particularly when it comes to Slavic Orthodox countries or regions, Serbia, Montenegro, Eastern Bosnia, Macedonia, or North Macedonia as we call it, Northern Kosovo, and Bulgaria. The Russian Orthodox Church has long been an instrument of Russian foreign policy. And to a certain extent, the Serbian Orthodox Church plays a similar role at times vis-a-vis Belgrade. Let me give you some interesting quotes. In June 2019, President Alexander Vučić of Serbia appealed publicly to Russia to, and I quote, protect the Orthodox Church, considering everything that is happening in Montenegro and the entire region, unquote. Soon thereafter, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, called for, and I quote again, a strengthening of the unity of the Orthodox people, unquote. And then Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Zakharova accused the United States, and here I quote again, of obviously intending to bring a schism into the Orthodox world and to destroy the integrity and the spiritual space of the Balkans, unquote. Well, I consider that part of a sort of a Russian political philosophical campaign, if you will, which tends to portray Russia as a defender of traditional values, fundamental values, the family, the church, the state, the homeland, counterposed, as they put it, to the West, which they see as a decadent power in descendancy. This narrative further distinguishes modernization from westernization and envisages the rise of multiple power centers, each with their own standards, each with their own values, decidedly not in emulation of the United States or the West. In the Ukraine, Russia is deploying World War II terminology and identifications, the denazification of Ukraine. And a parallel to that we see in the Balkans, with very often people using identifications from World War II and then making a false transference of that to events or people of today. Cyber warfare, Russia has employed cyber warfare to destroy infrastructure, to perform what's called network penetration, and to conduct espionage against Western governments that are supporting Ukraine. Disinformation is being deployed by Russia against Ukrainian and Western public opinion, and this is becoming legion. It's becoming very common in the Balkans, to the point where the US government has asked NATO to deploy hybrid warfare teams to the Balkans to help combat this. There is a team currently deployed from NATO in the in Montenegro, and from the United States in Croatia. And finally, of course, it's in Russia's interest to encourage instability in the Balkans. This is not because of some negativistic instincts that are natural to the Russians. Rather, I think it's politically based. If you can somehow strengthen already existing ethnic differences and ethnic divisions, then this becomes one of the divisions that perpetuates the lack of societal cohesion. And this, of course, would be a prerequisite for these states to join the European Union and to join NATO. And I don't want to be left without giving a few ideas for what might be done in the future, but this is not probably only the Balkans. I think, number one, we have to continue to support strongly the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. Number two, we must really be serious about the hardening, the respect of state borders, however those borders were originally created, full respect for the borders of European states and states in the Balkans. Number three, I think we need to work to harden non-military infrastructure in the Balkans. Roads, facilities, transportation, energy facilities. Number four, we need to bring NATO into the Balkans. They're already here in Romania, and I think most Romanians are very satisfied with that. They're in Bulgaria. But we must bring NATO into other Balkan states that are willing to receive them. And I'm talking about assets, I'm talking about people, I'm talking about equipment. Number 5, there should be a fast track to membership, and we have heard this from a previous panel, a fast track for membership for Bosnia and for other Balkan states, both into the European Union and into NATO. And my last point is probably my most important, number 6, and that is making sure that we communicate with the people, that we ask the people what it is that they expect, what it is that they want. This so often is overlooked. We need to organize tribunals, we need to organize talk groups or seminars for not only in the states that are candidates for NATO, so that people understand what are the obligations, what are the benefits, what are the situation with belonging to NATO, belonging to the European Union. But we need to do this in our own states, to tell our people why it is important to have strong defense budgets, why it is important to have NATO. You know, I heard in the last panel potential problems with my own country, with the United States. And I wonder what would happen if somebody organized a referendum on NATO in the U.S. state of Missouri or the U.S. state of Montana. What would be the result of the vote? We must educate our people. That is the future of the educated democracies. Thank you.
Ambassador, on a personal note, that was quite sobering, what you said, particularly at the end. Ladies and gentlemen and dear friends, we are over time by 1 minute. The challenge is that what's beyond this minute is lunch. So it depends on how hungry you are, or whether you are starving for more answers. A quick survey. Any questions? Short, crisp, to the point, and to any member of the panel. Yes. Yes, miss. Please.
Hello, I'm Miruna Putnagotronkota. I'm an expert on the Western Balkans and associate professor in Bucharest. And I would have a question for our colleagues from the region, Mr. LATAL and VUKSANOVIĆ. In terms of Romania's policy towards the Western Balkans, what would you see as the most important strength that Romania has shown in promoting the European integration of the Balkans? And what do you think is the greatest weakness? What can Romania do more for the region? Because the impression is that there is a lot of rhetoric for Romania supporting the Western Balkans, but in reality, its, let's say, position in the region doesn't seem so powerful. At least this is one of the opinion. What's your take on that?
Having in mind that we stand between you and lunch, I'll be very brief. As you said, the position of Romania is not extremely visible. Romania essentially falls on most of the issues, falls within the general positions of the European Union. One thing that I believe that Romania, as well as every other EU member country, could and should do is to really press upon other EU member countries as well as European Union institutions, Commission and Parliament and everyone else, to finally get from words to deeds and to become concrete. And because again, as was said in the previous panel, European Union is about, or has maybe already lost Western Balkans. And the consequences for the Balkans and for the entire Europe may be dire, and the time is running out.
Well, I mean, Srecko mentioned about the region, so I won't speak, but I mean, I can definitely speak about my own country. Now, Romania, in rhetorical terms, may support the integration of the remaining countries in either the EU or NATO, but the problem is that in case of Serbia, EU's leverage is very weak because Belgrade always knows that EU is not enlarging anytime soon, so that leverage is very, very weak. As we Serbs like to say, I mean, threatening, for example, Serbia that they will not be accepted in the EU is threatening someone with an empty gun, so to speak. And NATO, I mean, on that point, Romania also cannot be very useful because the large majority of the population is against it. Of course, Romania has a couple of capitals. I mean, the perception of Romania in Serbia is extremely positive. I mean, Serbs know that old saying by Romanians, Serbia and Black Sea are the only neighbors with which Romania has never waged a war. And yes, it has a positive perception because it hasn't recognized Kosovo. But I think that from what I can see, that bilaterally between Bucharest and Belgrade, there are two things which haven't caused, I wouldn't say hostility, but they have caused something of a cooling down. Number one is the Russian factor. I mean, because traditionally the two reasons why Romania hasn't recognized Kosovo, number one is the issue of Hungarian community, and because according to the Romanian interlocutors I spoke of, they always said pressuring Belgrade on Kosovo pushes Belgrade in Moscow's embrace. That has been Romanian philosophy according to some of my Romanian colleagues. But I think that now, in pairing with the Russian factor, there is a problem that I think that Bucharest is becoming very uneasy about Belgrade's partnership with Viktor Orban's Hungary. So that has become a complicated factor, but I definitely think that worsening of the wider security environment in Eastern Europe as a result of the war, you have Romania, which is on the front line, so to speak, as a Black Sea littoral country, but you also have Serbia, which is, so to speak, a land hinterland to Romania at that point. I think that there should definitely be more initiatives to see, particularly on the security and particularly on trade and infrastructure, whether there is something that Belgrade and Bucharest can do together.
Thank you. Yes, the last question.
Thank you very much. Dan Dungacic, New Strategy Center for Ambassador JACKOVICH. Two very short questions. The first one is, in November, the EU Security Council is supposed to vote the extension of the EU mandate, EU forces in Bosnia. It's Russia and China could veto this. So in these circumstances, a more presence of NATO in Bosnia is political, I don't know, not necessarily for Russia. It's acceptable if the EU presence is voted by Russia and China at the EU Council. So NATO presence is not related to the EU, it's related to Dayton agreements, of course, but could be a message that the Americans will take the lead and the NATO presence, that American presence will somehow replace in one way or another EU in the region. So it's ready, America, to take the lead in this respect. And the second question is, Orthodoxy is associated with Russia. Well, and the Orthodox churches are associated with Russia in the Western Balkans and in the region. Well, there are some stereotypes, but sometimes they are. But what about the churches which are part of the Western world, so to speak, EU and NATO, Romanian Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Patriarch of Constantinople? What these churches can do in order to send the message that Orthodoxy is compatible with the Western or European Union or the Western world? What they can do in the Balkans, or I don't know, in Ukraine or Republic of Moldova? Thank you.
I don't think the dispatching of NATO troops to particular regions would be in contrast or in conflict with whatever else is happening with the European Union and European troops. We have a European troop presence currently in Bosnia, currently in Kosovo and other places that I think is very useful and probably being increased. But they can be augmented, I believe, in some instances there would have to be a lot of legal hurdles that would probably have to be overcome and addressed, but they can be augmented, I think, by NATO troops. And in as much as the people welcome them, and in as much as the local authorities are welcoming of them, then I think that would be a positive thing for us to do, us meaning the West and the NATO community, and particularly at this time vis-a-vis crisis with the Russians. As far as the church question is concerned, I think there is a role for the church to play, and it should be a very, very positive role. And that may sound like a cliche, but I'm thinking, as I say this, I'm thinking of what happened in Montenegro, which, and I often talk about Montenegro, but it seems to me that the de facto installation of a government by a church is exactly the wrong direction that anybody could possibly go. When I saw this, when I witnessed this, I was at once astounded and astonished at what was happening. But at the same time, it really impressed upon me what are the latent, powerful situation that the church has. And this can be used in a negative way, it can be used in a positive way, particularly in very traditionalist societies in the Balkans. If we're talking about Eastern Bosnia, if we're talking about North Macedonia, whatever, there the church has a stronger role than many people may believe. And we in the West have a certain, I would say, we have a different view of the role of the church. We are constantly telling people, well, you need to have freedom of religion. And we view this from the prism of our own history, our own existence. Freedom of religion, that's how the United States was first formed, if you want to go back to the beginning. But when it comes to the Balkans, religion and the church has a very, very different role, and you must be very, very careful and very, very sensitive about that role. It is very different from the role that it plays in the United States or the West.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, and to take it the other way around, Ambassador, Professor ASLAN, Mr. LATAL, and Mr. VUKSANOVIĆ, I thank you all for your patience and goodwill in approaching a thorny issue, which the Balkans mean, and for your wealth of perspectives, information, and your candor as well in introducing them. I hope you enjoyed it. I confess I did. And one word of remembrance only. Look again at the title of the forum in order to understand where we, Romania, and NSC, of course, by default, stand. We look at an integrated map, which is why we are so much concerned about what is going on there, which is why I fully agree we should do more and be more concrete, but this is another movie. Now we have an intermission. Run for your lunch. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great afternoon.